SUERF, the European Money and Finance Forum, bringing together policymakers, finance, and academia.
Welcome to this SUERF Baffi Bocconi e-lecture on policy bias in economic research and the epistemological problems of econometrics, lessons for designing economic policy processes. Before we start, let's recall what epistemology means. According to Wikipedia, epistemology is the philosophical study of knowledge. It's also called a theory of knowledge. It examines what knowledge is and what types of knowledge there are. It further investigates the sources of knowledge like perception, inference, and testimony to determine how knowledge is created. Another topic is the extent and limits of knowledge, confronting questions about what people can and cannot know. When Stefan Schmitz suggested to me this webinar a couple of months ago, I was reminded of my readings during student times of Value in Social Theory from 1958, which consists of a collection of Gunnar Myrdal's reflections on the relation between values and analysis of facts in social theory. My own takeaway back then was that it is very difficult, or indeed impossible, to conduct pure positive scientific economic analysis without introducing at least implicitly some form of normative value judgment. This happens in the first place through the selection of the research agenda itself, what you devote scarce resources to, then through the way you conduct the research, the data you use, etc., etc. Not to speak of the potentially selective presentation of results and the formulation of conclusions. This view contrasted with my later work at various European institutions, which requested from us young economists to observe a clear separation between analysis and assessment or policy advice. Economists were supposed to first and foremost provide facts and objective analysis. Political assessment and value judgments were reserved to the higher political levels of management. In a way, this question has haunted or accompanied me during my entire professional career. Given that you are here today, I assume similar experiences for you. We have an excellent group of researchers here with us today. Let me express my special thanks to Stefan Schmitz for initiating and designing this e-lecture. Stefan is the head of the macroprudential supervision unit at the Austrian Central Bank. Stefan is a member of various expert groups at the ESRB, the ESCB, the EBA, the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, and the EU Commission. From 1998 to 2003, he worked at the Austrian Academy of Sciences as a research fellow. Stefan is also on the board of the Institute Vienna Circle. He studied economics, business administration, and philosophy of science in Vienna at the LSE and at NYU. Stefan will lead us through today's discussions and also introduce the speakers. Stefan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ernest. Welcome to you all, and a special thank you to Zubin, Kevin, and Erika for the availability for today. Zubin Jelveh is an assistant professor at the University of Maryland in the College of Information and the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. His research focuses on the intersection of economics, data science, and social policy, with a particular emphasis on how society shapes scientific inquiry and the application of machine learning to public policy challenges. Before academia, Zubin worked as a journalist covering economics. Today, he will share his recent findings on political language in economics, and I will share the link to the paper later on in the chat. Then we welcome Kevin D. Hoover, who is professor of economics and philosophy at Duke University and senior fellow at the Center for the History of Political Economy at Duke University. And he's also the course director of the 23rd Summer School of the Vienna Circle Society and University of Vienna on the history and epistemology of econometrics in July 2025. He's also the editor of the History of Political Economy journal. And I will share the link to that summer school later on as well. Kevin will tell us how it is possible that subjective and non-epistemic values sneak into empirical economics despite the sophisticated framework of econometrics many of us use. And Erica Thompson is Associate Professor of Modeling for Decision Making at the University College of London, Department of Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy, where she works on a program of research and policy engagement on the topic of using mathematical models effectively to support real-world decision-making in various fields, from climate adaptation to financial risk management. She's the author of the recent book, Escape from Model Land. And Erica will tell us about why expert judgment is indispensable in many of these analyses, despite the application of rigorous theoretical and empirical models, and how that affects the objectivity postulate of research. Each of the three, if you have 13 minutes in the first round, and then we have a quick second round of 1 or 2 minutes where you can reflect on each other, and then we open the floor for about 30 plus minutes to the audience. Well, having said all that, Zubin, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. Thank you so much for inviting me here today to speak about our paper. I'm really fascinated to hear what the other speakers will be talking about. You know, as I prepared this talk, I thought it was going to be a bit of a hot take, but hearing what Ernest said at the up top, I have a feeling maybe it won't be as hot takey. One other thing I want to say up top is I definitely come from an American perspective, and so what I say about economics is through how economics is practiced in the United States. I have a feeling, and you know, some readings that there are differences in how values sort of intersect with economics, maybe in Europe versus the U.S. So please bear that in mind. So let me dive in. You know, the talk, I titled it "Economics, Ideology, or Toolkit," and so these are reflections on our paper and sort of the long process it took to actually get it published. So, you know, economics has long prided itself on being one of the most scientific of the social sciences, with sophisticated mathematical models, rigorous empirical methods, and a commitment to value-free analysis. And economists have positioned themselves as objective experts providing neutral technical advice. But is this self-image accurate, or is it perhaps sort of part of the problem? So I'm going to explore this in the next 10 minutes. And let me start off with a pivotal moment in sort of this debate here. With this, you know, one of the pivotal studies in sort of the in the empirical turn in economics. So probably most of you are familiar with this, but David Card and Alan Kruger came out with this minimum wage study in 1993 that I think highlights this tension perfectly. Their study found that minimum wage laws did not increase unemployment, which is one of the basic conclusions of the dominant theoretical framework at the time, and arguably still in some circles. And, you know, they used a natural experiment comparing fast food restaurants in New Jersey, which raised minimum wage, versus those in Pennsylvania, which didn't raise this minimum wage, and they found something that you could say challenged the economic orthodoxy, that employment actually increased after the minimum wage hike. But what's most telling isn't the finding itself, but it's sort of what happened next. As Card later revealed in an interview with the Minnesota Fed, he said, you know, I've subsequently stayed away from minimum wage literature. It's cost me a lot of friends. Some of the ones I met at my first job at the University of Chicago became very angry or disappointed. They thought that publishing our work, we were being traitors to the cause of economics as a whole. Now, fast forward 2 decades later, here's Rod Shetty, you know, one of the most eminent economists, you know, definitely in the United States. Here's him writing in the New York Times in an article, in an opinion piece that was titled "Yes, Economics is a Science," where he presents a very different vision of economics than sort of what Card was facing at the time. He argues that economics is becoming more scientific through better empirical methods. You know, he ascribes sort of the root cause of many disagreements in the field to our limited ability to run experiments, and he sort of says, but you know, we've moved we've been able to sort of make gains here. Nearly a dozen economic studies have analyzed this question of the impact of extending unemployment benefits. These studies approximate medical experiments, which many economists sort of see as the gold standard, in which some groups receive a treatment while control groups don't. These studies have uniformly found that a 10-week extension in unemployment benefit raises the average amount of time people spend out of work by almost 1 week. This simple, unassailable finding implies that policymakers can extend unemployment benefits to provide assistance. And then down here, as the availability of data increases, economics will continue to become a more empirical scientific field. So this is sort of, if you could call it, this is maybe one of the pivotal moments in sort of like really defining the empirical turn in economics and how it sort of becomes solidified. But, but where, and I think this is sort of like where I can sort of talk about our paper, is this really true? Is this, pure, this real drive towards empiricism really leading us to this, a value-free approach to economics? In our research, we sort of asked a simple question: can we predict economists' political leanings just from the language that they use in their academic papers as sort of a first step? One thought is, if peer review is working, that should be harder to do. And the way we do this is we take the text of academic papers, we measure political leanings using a combination of whether an economist contributed to a campaign or whether they signed a political petition. And then we basically run a prediction model. I should add that this study started in 2011. We initially got rejected by all of the top 5. I think not surprisingly, we found a home in a European journal about 13 years later. And so one thing I want to make clear is we're using technology from 2011, 2012. ChatGPT is not involved in this analysis. I would love for someone to update this with more modern technology. And so, what we find is that there's correlation with ideology that sort of like permeates the field. I think, the headline result is that there is, the empirical estimates are correlated with ideology, but actually it sort of runs a little bit deeper than that, or much deeper. We find that, fields are pretty strongly correlated. And, it's probably not surprising. Finance, macro, law, lean right, whereas like labor, people who write in labor lean left. When we look at sort of the language in journals, we also find ideological valence. Sort of, among the most right-leaning journals is Journal Political Economy, one of the top 5. The other top 5 are a little bit more towards the center. There's no top 5 that's sort of like left-leaning. And when you look at the left-leaning papers in our corpus, they tend to be things related to Keynesian economics or non-American sort of journals. And so I think what this indicates is that this sort of is an indication that the correlation with ideology sort of permeates various ways in which sort of economics is done. I think one salient example I'd like to point out is, when we look at sort of like which phrases are more likely to be used by sort of like the left versus right-leaning economists, these two sort of pop up. Like child support pops up as like the most left-leaning phrase. And child support comes up as one of like the top 10 right-leaning phrases, and child care is the most left-leaning phrase. And I was curious, what an AI might think about these terms. So I asked my sort of personal favorite AI right now, Anthropic's Claude Sonnet 3.5. Can you tell me sort of like what the political valence of these terms might be? And not surprisingly, or maybe depending on you. It lined up pretty much with what we were finding, which Sonnet, I guess I should call him, or her, or it. Child support is more frequently invoked in conservative arguments, often in discussions about personal responsibility, welfare reform, and family structure, whereas child care appears more prominently in progressive liberal policy proposals, and sort of related to potentially like infrastructure, market failures, and things along those lines. And so I think the fact that these things are so salient in our data, it sort of points to that these aren't just semantic differences. They reflect potentially deep-seated assumptions about the role of markets, government, individual responsibility, and these are not showing up in economists' conclusions, but just in the very language that they use to sort of form their analysis. It's embedded in the system. Just one other sort of point along these lines is there's a much more recent paper that looks at the same exact question. They have a much more controlled design than we do. They're looking at like political scientists, sociologists, and economists, so it's a mix. But they basically they use a many analyst one data set approach, and they find a similar result where researchers who prior to studying the data said they were anti-immigration. When they studied immigration, they found that immigration reduces support for welfare programs, whereas researchers who said they were pro-immigration, they found this opposite result. And this paper sort of shows that the way that these things seem to happen is via like outcome definition, which sort of waves of this particular survey you include in the data. So this is another sort of data point on the prevalence of this stuff. And so this sort of begs the question, how should we think about this ideological influence? Another very recent paper sort of looks at the conflict of interest sort of discount, and sort of looks at, it does a survey where it asks economists and the general public, what if you found out a paper had involved an author that had financial conflict of interest, professional conflict of interest, and ideological conflict of interest. And for all three, they find that, there's big drops in trust, but surprisingly, I think the ideological conflict of interest is sort of like the least loss in trust. I don't have any sort of interpretation of that at that point, but I just sort of want to sort of highlight that people do take these things into account, and it does seem to matter for how they inject these studies. I should say a couple of the conclusions that these authors draw is that the current disclosure system lacks credibility, and conflicted papers must be systematically discounted in literature reviews, legal proceedings, and academic promotions, which is pretty broad strokes. I work in an interdisciplinary department, a lot of qualitative work, and one thing that comes up is in this discussion is disclosure part of the answer? Should we sort of require researchers to sort of say what their ideology is, so to help us sort of better measure what the actual consensus level is? This is something that's known as reflexivity statements in qualitative research. While I do think that this is a promising approach, thinking about mandatory disclosure of political views, that just doesn't seem like it would sort of pass muster. Might impede on legal rights, and might impede on academic freedom. So it's not. I don't have any solutions for this, but to the extent that this is one way to think about it, this does seem to be challenging. So just to wrap up here, I think what this points to again is that the finding on the correlation with empirical results is just sort of tip of the iceberg. I think it's it might be fair to say that the philosophical consensus is that the sort of doing value-free science is not really possible, and so I think where that leads me is that we should be trying to study make the values that sort of shape science an object of study to sort of help us move forward here. And so if we think about just again, I asked ChatGPT this time what are the values that shaped economics in the 20th century, and the things that it said were individual rationality, self-interest, market efficiency, quantification, methodological individualism, sort of a Western Anglo-American perspective, emphasis on efficiency over equity, so on and so forth. I think definitely within the American context, this reads sort of like very right-leaning framing. I think I would describe sort of like more modern values that are more ascribed now are empirical rigor, experimentation, skepticism of structural models without empirical backing. And I think but the question is like, does this empirical sort of turn, what has that done to the place of the old values? How much of those still exist? How much of those still sort of like dictate what's going on? And I think that's important because this is headline from last week in the New York Times, which are basically that economists are in the wilderness. Can they find a way back to influence? Basically talking about how both in the Biden and incoming Trump administration, unlike, maybe in Obama or Clinton and Bush, economists are certainly taking a second seat when it comes to policy. And I think so, and potentially one path forward for economics as a field is trying to look at the sort of the foundation in order to potentially get out of this quagmire. But with that, let me stop there, and thank you so much again.
Thank you, Zubin. Well, Kevin, how is it possible that all these subjective values, non-epistemic values, sneak into empirical economics despite the rigorous econometrics we'll use now?
Okay, well, I'll try to say something about it. I would just say first that I am somewhat of a skeptic that political bias is the main problem. I'm reminded of a epigram from E.B. White, an American essayist. He says, "All writing slants the way a writer leans, and no man is born perpendicular, although many men are born upright." Bias here is a tricky notion. White's epigram that no man is born perpendicular is pointing to the fact that when we talk about bias, we're implicitly talking about the idea that there is some particular truth that we have access to on which we could judge. So on the political spectrum that Zubin finds his economists spread along, where would be the neutral point? And that's the problem, is we don't have a clear, obvious way of saying, well, where would somebody be if they were unbiased? But White's other point of his epigram is to say that despite the fact that people are leaning one way or the other, that there is a kind of uprightness, a kind of doing the right thing that is worth valuing, and in the end probably brings us out in a better place than we might think. So I've been asked actually to talk explicitly about the epistemology of econometrics. Epistemology is a very big topic. Econometrics is a very complicated topic. So I just want to frame it in terms of the question that Stefan asked me. How is it possible that non-epistemic values sneak into empirical results when we have such a rigorous and sophisticated econometric toolbox? I think the focus here on technique misleads. Non-epistemic values don't sneak in. They come in through the front door, and we need to see how they come in. But I'm going to maintain that they don't rule out the possibility that we have some naturally positive rather than normative attempt to maintain some kind of objectivity. But we have to see what that objectivity actually amounts to. A lot of the problem with this way of thinking, and this goes back to Ernest's original comment at the beginning of the session, is econometrics and technical economics is thought about generally in terms of the world of the textbook. And in the world of the textbook, we have an absolutely well-specified truth, and we can ask questions like, do certain methods, are they unbiased in the sense of, if I knew the truth, would they give me the truth if I had full information? This idea of the unbiased estimator is like that. And what this is asking us to do is to take a kind of God's eye view of the world. And we can do that in the context of a textbook, but we can't really do it in the real world. It's useful when we're developing tools, but it's not particularly useful when we're using our tools to think that way. Economists, I think, are naturally realists. We believe that there is a way that the world is, but in our applied work, we're not granted the God's eye view. We can't be certain that we have a complete and accurate specification. We're trying to discover what works. We want to be constrained by the facts, but we don't get to make up whatever we choose. That's what we want. We want to be constrained in that way. But because of our limitations, we're forced to take different perspectives on the world. We approach the world in a piecemeal fashion, and we adopt a point of view. And philosophers call this perspectivalism. We're forced into that position because we have limited cognitive abilities, limited tools and techniques. I mean, Zubin was saying if he did this work again, that he'd use different tools because they're better tools. That's fine. Our vision is also local. It's not the whole picture. We look at particular data sets in particular contexts for particular countries, and we have to make choices about how we define variables, functional forms, all those things. And here's the point, is those choices are purpose-driven. We don't simply go out and look for the truth. We're motivated by questions that matter to us, by things that we want to know, usually because they're things that we want to do or promote or think are important. You know, our reasons, our goals, our purposes, these are all involved non-epistemic values. Our research is not disinterested, but motivated, and it should be. But the research process itself adds another layer of complication. It is itself normative. We have to make decisions about epistemic values that guide the choices within the research project. What is good science, for instance? So think about something like trying to balance out type 1 and type 2 error. That seems like a kind of technical thing. We'd say we make conventional decisions about where critical values are, that kind of thing. But on the other hand, choosing that balance is also a matter of trying to reflect the risks that we think are at stake in the world when we make mistakes one way or the other. These are a route through which non-epistemic values are coming into what look like technical questions. So you can just think of simple examples here. There are many, many, many different kinds of price indexes, and there are different theoretical kinds of price indexes, Posh indexes and Laspera indexes and chain indexes, and there are many different kinds of bundles, and what consumption bundles you want to use. So when you compute a price index, you're making a lot of choices, and you may think, well, those are technical, but you're computing any particular index for a purpose. And the purpose, for example, if you're trying to compensate people for cost of living, is going to be a different price index probably than if you're a central bank interested in what is the effect of monetary expansion on interest rates. Those things are being driven by outside normative choices. But I want to say that perspectivalism here is not a license to a pure relativism where anybody can believe what they want to believe. It's completely compatible with there being a kind of realism that when we take a perspective, yes, we're following for a different goal, but if somebody else who doesn't share our perspective comes along and wishes to occupy it and ask us, are we getting the right answers? There should be a right answer within the perspective. There should be an ability to get a kind of common agreement when people look at each other's work. And this shows up, I think, in Zubin's paper. He gives an example of the different estimates of the elasticity of labor supply that vary according to political party. Well, there's lots of technical reasons behind why those estimates actually vary, and there are normative reasons why people prefer one estimate over the other. Are they cooking the books? Well, maybe, but the way to check that is to go and look at their work and to lay out and figure out how it is that their results differ from my results. And I think this is where objectivity comes in here. Objectivity is not getting at a truth as a single fixed point. It's engaging in an activity in which we try to sort out why these differences occur. So if I get different results from yours, you can just discount them and say, oh, that's political. But what we really need to do, I think, is to look and see, well, why do we get these different results? Are we actually looking at different questions so they're not really incompatible? Or are we getting qualitatively similar results or qualitatively related results that are quantitatively different because of the particular context, like which data set we're using, which country we're in, that make them different, so they're again compatible? Or are we actually addressing the same question, but we've made a lot of choices, some of which are outside normative choices, but some of them are the kind of choices we have to make every day in setting up and framing our techniques, that we have no choice but to make them one way or the other, and we choose them particular ways, and we get different answers. And then we want to know why those answers are different. I mean, we could both be wrong, but we could also, one of us be right, or there may be some middle ground where we have some kind of unifying idea of how to take and make results complementary. We can run horse races and see who gets better predictions, or we could run encompassing tests, to see who is using the information the best. The point is that we got to do the work of talking to each other, getting down into it, and finding out where the sources of difference are. And then we can make normative evaluations about whether we're going to stand by those differences or not. But that's where I think where the objectivity comes in, is in that activity of trying to sort out what is really dividing us. And this comes back again, finally, to to White's epigram, because he talks about upright men. What he means by that is people not trying to cook the books, trying to do the right thing, even if they have leanings to play fair by the rules. I think we need epistemic virtue here. An epistemic virtue is, pretty simple stuff in many ways. It's keeping an open mind, treating people in good faith, instead of Zubin's example of Card being losing his friends over a result that they don't like. Well, that is not epistemically virtuous. We need to be willing to sit down and in good faith interact with each other and to try to sort out where our differences are and to make our techniques better, to sharpen those differences in some cases. And in the end, we're going to have to live with the fact that we have different purposes and we're going to want different things to be true, but we don't get to just believe what's true just because we want it. So what we got to remember, I think, is that econometrics is a tool for reasoning. And I just want to quote from one of my favorite philosophers, David Hume, from 250 years ago, who says that reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. What he means here is that non-epistemic values cannot be eliminated because tools lack a purpose of their own, and diversity of outcomes cannot be eliminated because human purposes and goals and judgments are always going to differ. But that doesn't mean we cannot pursue a kind of objective and fair-minded research.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Erica.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed both of those contributions. I'll just share my screen because I have a few slides. So yeah, it's really super nice to hear all those reflections because I work on similar things, but I'm not an economist by background, really. My background is maths and physics, weather and climate science. And I've written a recent book, as was mentioned in the introduction, called Escape from Model Land. So I'll just sort of say a bit about what I mean by that, that model land, in my conception, is kind of where we are when we're inside our models. If we have constructed a model, maybe that's on a computer, it could be an Excel spreadsheet or a flowchart on the back of an envelope. It could just be a conceptual model of how we think things relate to each other, or it could be something enormous that only runs on a supercomputer. I'm quite open about what we count as a model. But of course, in model land, everything works. In model land, as Kevin said, in the textbook land, there is an answer at the back of the textbook. There are methods that work, and we don't have to worry about things that are outside the box of the model. We don't have to worry about anything else impinging on it. We can just do the thing, and within those boundaries, we get an answer. But of course, that's not where we live, and that's not where we make decisions. We live and we make decisions in the real world. And so having sort of constructed these mathematical objects, these models, we have to find a way of getting out of model land and transferring the insights that we make within a model to the real world, which is the real object of inquiry and the place where we want to take actions. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, I argue that there are two main ways of escaping from model land. And one is with respect to data. You say, was the model any good in the past or in other situations? And perhaps that gives me some level of confidence that it might be good for the thing that I'm trying to do now. So you check it against the real world and say, did it actually match up? But then, of course, we also need expert judgment. We can't do without expert judgment. We can't rely solely on data because we also have to include the judgment that the past is a good reflection of the future, or that the performance in one situation is a good guarantee that it will perform well in another situation. And so we are stuck making these expert judgments about model quality. To what extent do we think that the assumptions that are made in the model are ones that will continue to be true in the future, or that will continue to be true when we transfer the model into a new situation? Okay, so to make that a little more concrete and to show a graph that hopefully will not be too difficult for any of the audience members here, let's just think about a very simple model. Supposing we have a set of data points and we are fitting a curve to those data points. So we have this set of white crosses here and we want to draw a line through them. And you might go to Excel and just fit a line, or use your favorite programming environment, whatever that is. And you fit a line, okay, you can do that. But supposing we said, well, actually, we could fit a curve instead. Well, we could do that. We might get a slightly better fit. What my point is that when we are within what I've drawn as a white box here, we're within the domain of the data that we have to calibrate this model. And so we are essentially interpolating between data points that we already have. We are using the model to interpolate. There'll probably be some uncertainty, but it also probably doesn't matter a great deal what functional form we choose to fit. It's probably A, reasonably obvious what the functional form is, and B, it won't be critical. You know, you can see from the drawing here, it doesn't really matter whether I picked a linear or a quadratic fit. I'll still get more or less the same answer within that white box. But of course, as soon as we try to go outside that white box, we are extrapolating. And I've drawn this in 2 dimensions, but you could imagine it in 20 dimensions if your brain works that way. And you can start to see how difficult this is going to be. Because in general, we are extrapolating. In general, what we want to do is extend beyond the range of the data that we have previously gathered, experienced, and used to calibrate our model. But I suppose what I want to highlight here is that there are some circumstances in which epistemic values do not greatly influence the outcome of our models. You know, if I make a model of, I don't know, say the trajectory of a basketball, if I throw it, it doesn't matter whether I have politically conservative or, you know, left-leaning or right-leaning inclinations, we will still get the same answer. You could get multiple people with different political stances to do that, and they would get the same answer. It doesn't matter. But as soon as we start to extrapolate, we can see that actually there's a radical indeterminacy here. I could choose to fit something much more complicated, which would also do equally well in interpolation. But, you know, we can see that it could diverge to infinity in opposite directions as soon as we get outside that calibration range. And so we have this radical indeterminacy, which is only resolved by appeal to expert judgment. And as Zubin and Kevin have both explained, that appeal to expert judgment then brings in many non-epistemic values and epistemic values as well about what good science is, and about perhaps inductive risk, as Kevin mentioned. We may be more worried about getting the answer wrong in one direction than another answer, and that will push us to kind of resolve our uncertainty in one direction rather than another. So if we're in this kind of middle white box, we have what I call data-driven models. We have a situation where it isn't critical what our non-epistemic values are. It isn't critical what our political leanings are. We could, for example, ask AI to solve this problem for us. And indeed, we'd find that AI can and will fit nicely an interpolatory problem. It might do it in an interesting way that we hadn't thought about. It might do it quicker and more effectively, but it doesn't necessarily introduce any hidden values into the process of doing that. Or if it does, they don't matter so much. As soon as we go into the extrapolatory regime, if we let AI or data-driven techniques loose on that, then we have much more of a problem, because it may well be introducing social and political values as some arcane function of the objective function that's hidden within this optimization program that we just don't know what they are. You know, it would take a lot of thinking. You know, even if that AI is not a black box, even if we actually knew exactly what the objective function was, it would still take some thinking to understand exactly how social and political values have become embedded there and how they will then influence the output that we see and that we try to use to inform our decisions. Okay, so hopefully that all makes sense. I wanted to talk just briefly about model error, because this is something that's particularly interesting to me. And I suppose I see model error as being the difference between model and reality. So you've made your model and then you go out and you say, well, how good was it? And you take some measurements and you subtract. So maybe there is a philosophical question that we can leave to one side about the commensurability of model land variables and real world measured variables. But let's just assume that we can leave that to the side and perform the subtraction. Then what is this model error thing? What is it that we're actually getting at the other end? And I want to argue that there are actually many ways of conceptualizing model error, and therefore many ways of dealing with model error and constructing better models. So if reality is out there and it's this big complex thing that we can't, even in principle measure everything about, we can only observe part of it. But it has very complex relationships. It has many different things going on that we just don't understand, and some things that we do understand. And those things that we do understand, we have hopefully encapsulated in a model. And the model is probably, many of the models that I work on, for example, are weather and climate models, and they are large, complex systems in themselves. Economic models, some are very large, complex systems, some are much simpler, but I think we can take the same approach. And we just perform the subtraction, right? So what are we getting at the other end? Well, if you are a statistician, then your approach to model fitting will be statistical. And you say, well, I'm just going to keep fitting more functions until the thing that's left over is random noise with some description. So it might be a normal distribution with some mean and standard deviation. It might be some more exciting form of random distribution. That's fine. But if you're a statistician, that's how you think about model error. And that will then influence how you choose to deal with it. Okay, but that's not the only way of thinking about it. Supposing you are a physicist like me, or you're a mathematician who's been trained in the physics and mathematics of complex systems, then perhaps you think of reality as being one big complex dynamical system, and your model may well be another big complex dynamical system. And when you subtract them, you get a third big complex dynamical system, but one that all the structure that you understood has been subtracted out of. So you've got a load of interesting structure, but it's really weird. So I'll just draw that kind of as this sort of mess of shards of interesting things happening. But again, that's not the only way of thinking about it. Supposing that I'm more of a kind of qualitative, perhaps an anthropologist thinking about models, perhaps a philosopher, then I say, well, reality is what's actually there. It's this thing that's out there, to the extent that we can see it and measure it. And the model encapsulates something actually that's much more about me than it is about reality, because it is my understanding. It's been projected into my personal space and my understanding. It is my, my priorities about what to model, my values, my expectations of what's important. It's probably, as the other two speakers have described, that might be influenced by my political leanings, what I think is important, what I want to get out of doing this modeling study. And so in that case, model error is something really different again. In that case, model error is the things that I didn't understand and the things that I thought were not important. So, well, that's not something that is really a mathematical object, is it? That's something that's inherently social and political and also quite personal. It's about me and my educational background and my priorities and my political leanings as well, perhaps my values, my education and understanding. So I find this, all of this a really interesting reflection on then how do we go forward with models? What is it that we need to do with models in order to make them more effective in understanding how any given system works, whether that's an economic system or a physical system, and how we want to interface with it in order to support better policy decisions, for example. And so what, I suppose I return to Donald Mackenzie's key insight that the model is an engine, not a camera. The model is not there to, just to take a snapshot and to be objective in some way, to capture what we understand. It's an engine which pushes our understanding forward. It shapes our understanding. It shapes the way that we think about the problem. It shapes even the things that we can conceive as being possible interventions into a system. So I think I'll stop there. I have many more reflections on this kind of theme, not specifically mostly aimed at economics, but if you're interested, my book, Escape from Model Land, deals with many of these ideas. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Erica. Before we open the floor to the audience, and we already have a couple of interesting questions here, I would like to have a second round on the panel. And my question here is that I think we have seen slightly diverging views on how important policy bias is, whether or not it's fair to speak about policy biases. Now, from the point of view of a policy-making institution like our central bank or the Basel Committee, we somehow have to find an end of that process of deliberation and take a decision. So what can we learn, Zubin, Kevin, and Erica, from our debate here for designing economic policy processes to deal with the potential for policy bias? Zubin, would you like to start again?
I wouldn't, but I'm happy to. Let me admit up front that this is a very challenging question. I think for me, one sort of like bifurcation that comes to mind is, and I think this sort of harkens to what Kevin was saying about econometrics is a tool. So, if we take that sort of to its logical extreme, and economics, modern economics, is really like a toolkit for studying policy, then what does that mean with respect to the type of policies that it studies? Should it sort of take a back seat and have the actual politique, basically, imagining we're living in a democracy, if their elected officials are saying, hey, study this, then economists sort of bring their tool and they study that, regardless of what the political beliefs are. And maybe the equilibrium there is that the policymakers realize, hey, I'm right wing, let me go find a right wing economist who will study this in an objective way, because I want my right wing worldview to sort of be pushed forward. I'm a centrist, let me find a centrist economist. I'm a liberal, let me find a liberal economist. Is that sort of like the logical conclusion of like what it means for economics to be a toolkit is? I think that's obviously like too simplistic. I think both, a couple of papers that we've shown here show that even that there's still going to be variation that might be influenced by ideology, but just as a thought experiment, that might sort of be one path forward, and I think that's as opposed to an economist sitting in an academic institution where they have the toolkit, but then they have like research freedom with respect to what they want to study. I think there's a lot more room for values to sort of like take force there. I think within policy, there's this question of like, what does it mean for economics to be a toolkit? So let me stop there.
Kevin.
I think that's some interesting points. I don't think we can make it so simple. This is actually the way that textbooks used to present this when they introduced the positive normative distinction at the beginning of an econ textbook. An economist could just be a technical agent, just doing the bidding of their bosses. A problem there is that even trying to do the bidding of your bosses, you still have to make all kinds of choices. So you're not going to come out in some way as a completely neutral agent. And it's not even clear, as my earlier point, what neutrality would be. But to try to get to Stefan's point, it may suggest certain kinds of institutional differences. So one thing that I like about the American central banking system, having worked in it when I was much younger, is that it is a federal system. There are 12 Federal Reserve banks. And one property of having 12 Federal Reserve banks is that they have different research departments with different agendas driven in part by their leaders, in part by the people who are in those institutions. And that multiplicity of voices puts a lot of things on the table and makes a lot of debate possible, which can sharpen the decision making. But I think as economists, we sometimes overestimate the importance of our individual work. I seriously doubt that any useful decision has ever been made by a central bank by taking, one academic paper that produces a result. We do something useful, which is to put a lot of information on the table. At the end, somebody has to make choices, and it's right that those choices be not us posing as neutral actors, but the policy people who are responsible for them.
Thank you, Kevin. Erica?
Sure. So, I mean, if central banks want to use models to inform policy processes and those models are inherently value laden, you have two options really. One is that you look for some form of what philosophers might call strong objectivity through deliberately finding models which exemplify the largest possible range of diversity of epistemic values. So you might deliberately seek out, as Kevin was describing, results from different institutions or different groups which you believe to represent, different value framings. That's one option. I mean, and the other option is to lean in and say, well, actually, we are a policy organization and we have a mission which does entail certain values. If you have some kind of idea of what it is that you're trying to achieve, that is a value. So you might then say, well, how can we construct models or encourage the construction of models which embody those values? And you could try to do that explicitly. Now, that potentially leads to problems. It's not necessarily a great thing to do. It would be a great thing to do if everybody was in clear consensus about what are the right values. But there are obvious possibilities for that to be abused. So then another option is simply to be transparent as transparent as possible about when and where values do come into these processes, which is why I think this kind of discussion is really helpful. And Zubin's work on, thinking about exactly how it is that values and political leanings do influence model results, that shouldn't make us take them less seriously. It should help us to come to a more considered understanding of how and where these are useful and where to seek out alternative perspectives and how to bring those alternative perspectives together, or to choose one if we think that's the right thing to do.
Thank you, Erica. Let's open the discussion to the audience. Thomas Meyer asked the following question. Scientists are not computers, but people. Can we still believe in unbiased scientific progress as described by Karl Popper, or do we have to accept that scientific progress follows the disruptional process, for example, described by Thomas Kuhn, the battle of paradigms, or Imre Lakatos, the competition of different research programs? Anyone a take on that? Yes, Erica.
Well, I can jump in with my perspective, which is that I'm not sure that the unbiased description has ever been particularly accurate. Obviously, it depends a little bit where we are, and if we're interested in, again, in the data-driven regime of the models that I suggested, if we're within that white box and we're only thinking about the data, then perhaps there's a role for Popper's ideas about falsification. But whenever we're thinking about anything to do with the future or anything to do with the humans and human activity and human relationships, we are inevitably going to be going outside that white box into extrapolation. And when we're extrapolating, there is no unbiasedness. So I would say we do have to accept that scientific progress follows, perhaps not exactly what Kuhn and Lakatos said, but something similar to that I would sign up for.
Yes, Kevin?
The reason I was trying to emphasize this, the point about perspective and point of view is that that's where a lot of these normative differences come in. But where Popper is strongest is to say, well, given your point of view, and you predict something, and it doesn't come true, then it's not very useful to you. It doesn't even support your normative goals if in your own framework you can't see it. And that's the sense in which we have to kind of respect the evidence, and there is a kind of objectivity in that. You know, if I have a model that is predicting you know, a certain result, and we've agreed on how to measure that, and we're not getting that result, we have to step back and we have to modify what we do. And that it's a process, not a simple thing. It's not once and for all, but we have to engage with that process. And the idea that a falsification is actually quite useful for that.
Erica, you wanted to add to that?
I'll just accept that all models can be falsified trivially. You know, all models are wrong. We will always be able to find ways in which they are wrong, but that doesn't mean that they're not useful. So I find falsification very unhelpful, which is not to say that, you know, observing a divergence between model and reality would help us to make an expert judgment that the model is not useful in terms of its insights. But there are many models which are quantitatively completely wrong and yet do help us to understand more about the world. And vice versa, there may be models which are very well fit to past observations, but actually don't necessarily help us to act better in terms of taking decisions which are more aligned with our values and generate the outcomes that we're seeking.
I'm not sure that we disagree, but I would frame it differently, which is to say, to the extent that a model is useful, it is because it has captured something which is true about the world, or given us a resource by which we can see something which is, or get closer to seeing something which is true about the world. So that my biggest point is just that we do have to have a feedback from the world. We don't get to just choose. We have to see how we're doing relative to, you know, how the world is.
That's true, but also many models, especially in economics, have some element of performativity in that we construct the model and then we act as if the model were true, and that helps to reinforce the truth of the model.
Absolutely, this is what differentiates the social sciences from, you know, from the natural sciences. The fact that we are creating our social world in part, so it's not completely fixed.
Ernest, you posed the question. I think you have access to the microphone. Would you?
Erica, you raised the interesting questions how values might flow into AI through the highly complicated process, how content is collected and assembled in AI programs. Now, this raises a new dimension of complication also for Zubin's future follow-up paper, when you will then somehow need to try to infer the political leanings of the AI implicitly, you know, visible. So how do we then cope with this problem?
You know, we're here in 2025 that have been sort of partially led by sort of like the values embedded within society that have influenced science, and I don't think we have a great sense of how that happened, and I think that's one of the research projects that we should undertake, because, you know, if we, to the extent that like values are inherently a part of science, we should look at those values and have an assessment to the, you know, obviously I'm greatly oversimplifying, are these the values we want moving forward? And I think that and since the AI is being built off of what we generate, the values that we throw off, the methods that we approach, I think like we sort of have to look inward first before we can sort of like look at the AI, to the extent that these AIs are being built off of data that we throw off. I think that would be sort of how I would think about that.
Thank you. Daniel Hardy raises the questions that in practice significant resources are available for comparing methods to understand how different results were obtained. Are there career incentives to conduct such comparisons? His impression is that successful economists focus on their own original research and they're very committed to their respective particular views and tend to be dismissive of the views of others. Nobody wants to take that, but it's quite difficult. Yeah, Kevin, go ahead.
I take it on because I think it's an absolutely real and important problem. We've already seen it in Zubin's quoting from the card example. I can think of examples in macroeconomics. Cristiano Eichenbaum and Trabant wrote a working paper that then became a Journal of Economic Perspectives paper. In the working paper version, the first line of the paper is anyone who is not working, any macroeconomist who is not working on DSGE models is a dilettante, completely dismissing every other possibility of how we might approach just even from a technical point of view, much less from having particular values or interests. I think one of the reasons we want to be committed to the idea of truth is that truth is a great promoter of humility. If you think there's a truth, if you really believe that there's a truth about the world and you understand your epistemic limits, then you ought to be humble about what you're claiming and you ought to be willing to engage with many, many different ways of thinking to see which ones work, to see which ones are effective. And you don't want to say, oh, I only look at RCTs because they're the gold standard. Remember the gold standard, we're not on it anymore monetarily because it was in many ways a failure. And, we don't want to get into that position by being this kind of prescriptive about what it is that we do. The other part of that question was, are there incentives for checking work? And the answer is not enough. That you don't get enough reward for trying to figure out, reproduce, and otherwise validate other people's work, at least among economists. And we ought to respect that activity more.
Daniel has a comment on your notion of upstandingness, Kevin, and he says it very much depends on being aware of unconscious errors, and new evidence of slanted results should be very useful. And I might add that in many cases, unsuccessful econometric work in which something we hope to be or we think should be significant turns out not to be. These papers are often much rarely published, and successful significant is much more likely to be published. Well, Ernest has a number of questions. Ernest, would you like to
I'm happy to come in. Now, one question relates to populism and science skepticism associated with it. We observe this in a couple of Western countries also. So what is the panel's advice or conclusion? Is value-influenced science, as imperfect as it may be, still not better than policy without science at all?
Yes.
That's
But how to achieve this acceptance then, in the public? Because, I mean, particularly during the pandemic, and also now with the backlash in climate protection, I think we're really not on a good track in that respect.
Well, I think that's a really good point. And perhaps this speaks to the need for more transparency about values in science, because really the problem here is that people have been claiming that science is completely value neutral, and the public can see through that. It's clear that it's not. So that doesn't make it bad science, right? That it is perfectly reasonable for science to be influenced by values, as long as we are clear about the way that happens and able to show it and able to take alternative perspectives. And then we can say, well, perhaps there is radical indeterminacy. Perhaps we have got a set of data and the answer actually could be anywhere between, 0 and 10. And if you wish to resolve that with respect to your values, perhaps if you're left wing, it comes out at the top, and if you're right wing, it comes out at the bottom of that range. Those are all reasonable, but they're probably, you can't get the answer of -50 and you can't get the answer of 300. So it is useful to be able to constrain those bounds. Now, I mean, climate change is something that I'm familiar with, and I think that we do have a problem of, you know, this kind of temptation to try to present everything as being completely objective and value neutral has backfired. And there's a tendency to then retreat further into saying, you know, this is the science, follow the science. And actually that's deeply unhelpful because it doesn't answer the question that's being asked.
Well, we could say something about the need for a better understanding, a better science education, perhaps, and the part so that the public understood what science can give them. My most influential philosopher on my life, Charles Peirce, who was a physicist and an economist and a semiotician and a logician, all kinds of scientific work, also an important philosopher, made this distinction between living science and what he called science on the shelf. Science on the shelf is those bits of science where they're no longer active because there's a great deal of consensus about them. That's what we teach in the textbooks, but that's not where the science lives. The science lives in the activity of advancing and checking, and the public needs to be aware that there is this difference between what is truly settled and what is still under debate. And the people selling their stuff as scientists to the public should be aware that when their work is still debatable, that they shouldn't try to present it as if, listen to me, I am science, as one of our political leaders said.
Zubin.
I think just one thing to add on to the sort of the populism point here is I wonder how much of the way that like science is socially constructed also impacts this. I think it's easiest to like look at economics because of its, you know, this stringent sort of like hierarchical structure, particularly in the US, where it basically like sort of like screams elitism, and like that's not sort of like what the sort of the popular mood is these days. And so like how does that like how did sort of like hierarchy become the quote unquote right structure, and why is it sort of and if that's sort of what part of the reaction that the public is having, sort of what went wrong there was, you know, is hierarchy sort of reflecting some values that aren't necessarily about sort of like truth and objectivity. I think I would add that.
I think the interesting tension emerges here between the inner view of those who conduct science, and as Kevin said, and you all said, you know, we know that there is some that value-free science is impossible, and we just have to deal with it, and we're more interested in the process. And then if we find different results, we meet at a conference, we discuss it, and when we find out where we disagree, and when we write another paper. And I think that the perception of the public, and I think that's to a large extent the result of how science presents itself outside of science, that it comes across as presenting results. What you, Kevin, referred to as off-the-shelf science. You know, if I need a result on a particular illness, I prescribe this. And so to a large extent, it's our own fault. But on the other hand, speaking as an employee of a policy institution, when we come up with macroprudential measures, we have to present our expert opinion to the committee and then to the authority, and in some cases to the court. And then we can show up there and see, you know, there are 25 opinions, and 3 of them are in favor of the measure, 7 are not, but we think they're not very good, and there are 10 that are indecisive. You know, we have to come up with something that's credible to the outside world, where they see, you know, we have taken our data seriously, we have acted in a rational manner based on rational, rigorous models, and it's somehow reduce the direct application of values. And I can just walk into a court and say, no, I thought it was the right thing to do. That's just not enough. And we need to find a balance between what we are interested in is academic work, where we, are even happy when someone reflects critically in our own work and we can write to rejoinder, versus what we need in policy, where we, have to come up at a decision at one point and base that decision on something that's defendable process and evidence and rational models. How can we resolve that tension? Erica?
Perhaps it depends partly whether you're interpolating or extrapolating. So, and somebody asked in the chat about the difference between physics models and economic models. And, if you are interpolating, if you really think you are interpolating, then it is more or less value free. We don't need to worry too much. I mean, apart from the judgment that we're interpolating and that the kind of output surface is in some useful sense smooth. But at the point of extrapolating, you just have to accept that you are extrapolating, but that doesn't leave us completely without reference point. We can all agree on the laws of physics. We can all agree that the sun will rise tomorrow, because if the laws of physics were not going to be true tomorrow, or the sun wasn't going to rise tomorrow, then we have bigger problems than dealing with economic policy, right? So there's a set of things that we all agree on, and I kind of see it like the kind of onion rings. We've got layers here. There are things that everybody will agree on, and then there are things that most people will agree on, and then there are things that hopefully everybody who has been educated or has a certain kind of experience might agree on, and then you go to things which are actually political, and maybe we just don't agree, and we're never going to agree. So how do we construct models that don't throw away the baby with the bathwater, that don't throw away that robust and confident core of understanding that we have, and that is the shared basis of all of the modern world, right? Your computer systems and your phone and your everything. It only works because mathematical models work, and they don't just work in interpolation, they can also work in extrapolation. But how do we know when we're going beyond that possibility and we're going into a kind of here be dragons environment where actually it might be that we are totally wrong? Well, the only way that we get some sense of that uncertainty and to be able to kind of statistically quantify uncertainty, and that's my interest here really, is by finding that diversity of perspectives. And if you say, well, I've really made the best effort to find 10 different people to inform me about this, and they all said that the answer was somewhere between 3 and 5. Okay, well, let's take that. That's good. That's a good warrant of confidence and robustness of that range. But if you found 10 different people and they give you answers which varied massively, then that indicates that actually we really don't know. There is some indeterminacy here, and then you have to decide what you want to do about it. And I think that there is a reasonable policy response of saying, actually, our policy decisions, governed by whatever our mandate is, are aiming to produce a certain set of outcomes, and these embody a certain set of values about the future, and therefore I will resolve that indeterminacy by choosing something with a certain value-laden slant. I think that's defensible. I don't think that's terrible. Or you say we just have to work with that range. We have to work with that very large level of uncertainty, and we'll just deal with it.
I think one difference between some of the systems you described, Erica, and economics is that the model, that white box, is the creation of the white box is value laden, very much so, and so I think with respect to like a policy institution, I think this goes back to the point that sort of like maybe the white box has been defined for you already, and then let's have like 20 different like estimates within there, and then we can come to an agreement. Whereas I think there's like a bigger picture here that maybe sits outside of the policy, like people sitting in policy spaces now, is like who decides what the color of the box is, or like how the data is defined that goes in the box, which I think is is just all throughout the literature. I think those decisions are all over the place.
I see. Yeah, one of the large questions, of course, in macroprudential policies: what's the acceptable level of systemic risk? Your society as macroprudential policymaker or as committee member, are willing to take. So let's move on to a question by Aaron Jarowski. So he asked, should we rather talk about lessons for designing the processes in science rather than in policy making, when we see that already in science there are incentives that do shape scientific questions, or as you, Kevin, said, that the replication of econometric studies is not a very popular subject, and we have a common friend, Spanos, who does a great deal of work on that. So should we think about better incentives in science?
That's, you know, we do need that, and but it's not clear how to make that happen. And I'm actually interested in, maybe Erica can reflect on this, about how this is different in the sciences that she knows better. Zubin pointed out the hierarchical nature of economics, and I think that some of that hierarchy and some of the kind of elitism that's involved in the social structure of economics actually militates against the kind of work that you're talking about that might change the structure, you know, of economics. And I wonder whether those problems are as acute in other sciences.
Well, do you want me to reflect there? I mean,
yeah,
I think that I think economics is quite unique, perhaps, in the culture and this, what you've described as a very hierarchical way of thinking. I think the other sciences, I mean, physics also struggles with you know, truly believing itself to represent the universe as best we possibly can, and you know, really struggling to accept that there could be values and value ladenness within physical theory. But of course, when we start to move into policy arenas, it becomes more obvious. It becomes harder to avoid both critique externally and also, you know, observation internally that what we're doing perhaps isn't necessarily the most useful thing. So, you know, if we think about how climate science could be done more effectively, I'm really interested in how we diversify climate model ensembles, and that doesn't mean taking the models that we have less seriously. It means designing them more effectively to ensure that we have a diversity of perspectives within the modeling strategies, and therefore you know, triangulating more effectively, being able to say, well, what is how if we tried to push these models as far apart as we possibly could, how far can they go before we just say, no, that really doesn't work, and that actually would be more informative than just making multiple copies of the same model and convincing ourselves somehow that makes us more confident that what it says is the right answer. So I do think that designing processes in science is really important. I think that there's a lot to be explored there, but I'm not sure how, you know, in the economic field, I wonder what you know, what it is that is really the kind of point of least resistance. Where can we start this conversation? Like, is this a good conversation to have? What are the points of this conversation that are resonating with however many people are in the audience right now? I'd be interested to hear that, because I think, you know, finding the way in and the framing that makes sense in a particular context, for me in climate and physics, it's about statistically quantifying uncertainty more effectively, and I find that a really fruitful argument to make towards model diversity and to help people understand the value ladenness of science. So I wonder, in the economic framing, what you know, which aspects of this discussion the other panelists might think are the, or the audience might think are the key points that change the way that you think.
One move in the right direction, just quickly, one move in the right direction has been that more and more journals are requiring that data be made transparent and methods be adequately documented, so that checking work is a possibility. I mean, that's just one small step, but it's an important one.
Yes, and I think there are now also journals that do publish critical econometric studies that are replicating other studies, and so it starts to become a field in and of its own right, and with certain academic merits, I hope. Zubin, you wanted to add?
But can you get tenure that way?
I think there is one of the things to like about I should have admitted this up front. I'm not an economist. My PhD is in computer science. I just sort of pretend to be one sometimes. But you know, I think one of the things that really turned me on to economics is the empirical turn, and you know, all these robustness tests. I think on the face of them, they're very valuable. I think what needs to happen next is with that sort of like what's been known as sort of like this multiverse analysis is like, how do we, yes, it is important for us to sort of like see all the decisions that you made and how these estimates could change if you sort of like define your outcome in a different way, but that then leads to like, you know, hundreds of thousands of models. So I think there needs to be worked on like, how do we sort of distill this multiverse into something that's sort of like that's salient to sort of like consumers of that research. And I had another point which I forget, so I'll shut up.
We have two more questions in the chat. Ismail Sirek asks if physics is a science in which moral and religious values of a researcher don't matter for the way of making research, why should that not be the case for economics? What are the main problems?
That's not true. So I think physics is there's this actually really great. If you look on YouTube, there's a former physicist that basically has a YouTube series on all the different ways in which sort of like physics has been dominated by, you know, patriarchy and things like that. And so I sort of reject the basis of that question.
I see, and Erica just posted that answer in the chat as well. Lauren Schüssler asked, is there a trade-off between reliability in isolating and identifying individual treatment effects and the relevance of results for policy evaluation? He's thinking of something like, gee, the very much qualitative historical approach of Roma and Rover 24, choosing the Federal Reserve Chair, lessons from history. And the related question is, how should we choose truly meaningful explanatory variables?
That's an absolutely huge question. I don't know that there's a short answer to it.
You have 2 minutes.
I don't think I can do it in 2 minutes, but it's a question on point.
Maybe I can say I think there probably is a trade-off between this reliability and relevance, and perhaps it's to some extent related to the model land question, that actually if we define a really clear, simple, easy to understand model and we have the right data and we fit the model, and then we may get clear results, but they won't be very relevant because of everything else that happens outside model land, because reality is so messy and so many things are happening and feeding back and influencing each other, that actually we don't have models which are capable of doing all of those really complex things. And even if we did, we wouldn't get a particularly robust, nice, easy answer because of all those other things that are going on. So I would say kind of, yes, I think there probably is a direct trade-off, and it's related to this sort of simplicity of model versus accuracy, if you like, you know, ability to take into account comprehensively all of the things that might be happening, that actually we go further and further towards just replicating the world itself in a model, and that's no use at all, because if we didn't understand the world, then we're not going to understand the world model either.
Aaron Jarowski suggested procedural reform in science could consist of obligatory disclosures of value questions that might be important to a model that's about to be published. Should we go down that road?
I think so, because I don't think that you can't use that information mechanically. You can't elicit it reliably. People would, even if, I mean, I don't think it's particularly going to be useful information, but even if you did think it was in principle useful information, people would learn to give the right answers, as they do for many things, rather than the answers that are actually revealing of what their own position is.
Yeah, I'd agree. I don't think it's very feasible, and I don't think it would be very useful. I think what would be really useful is to kind of teach the consumers of model output. So rather than putting the onus on the modelers to kind of disclose everything, and then you end up in a sort of regulatory arms race where they just disclose everything and it's completely unmanageable. To say, well, how do we teach the consumers, whether that's policymakers or the general public or, you know, some environment, how do we teach people to ask the right questions? How do we teach the people that are trying to use these models to inform decisions? What do they need to ask about uncertainty? What do they need to ask about values? What do they need to ask about what's not in the model? How do they need to kind of conceptualize and understand what kind of expert judgment went in, and decide for themselves whether they are in agreement with that or whether it satisfies their you know, the processes that they expect to go in to producing information which is of value to them and to that decision. And those standards might differ depending what kind of decision you're trying to inform. Obviously, some are much more high stakes than others, and you would need to do much more due diligence. I mean, this is partly what my book attempts to do, right, is to be able to say, how do we help create an informed market for the models, informed customers and clients to be able to ask these effective questions which will help them to understand the degree to which it is useful to use the models and the degree to which actually it may be misleading or it may be misaligned with their values.
Thank you. We are coming to an end. Thank you very much. It was extremely interesting. Also, thank the audience for the questions and comments. My three main takeaways are that we need to invest a bit more in communicating what we do in empirical economics to those who make the decisions. So one takeaway is that our models should not be too complex, that we should offer explanations that help those who are not empirical economists to really understand what we do, rather than see end result at the end of a rather complex set of slides. The second takeaway is that decision-making by committees seems to be a good way to bring diversity to the table. And I think that our macroprudential committee here in Austria is an example of that. And the Basel Committee employs a research group of which I'm a member, and there are 25 people from very different countries and backgrounds, and all our output is discussed in the entire group. So even if there might be political bias in one or two views, everybody else there might help to challenge that and at least make that transparent. And the third takeaway is that within my own work and our own work here at the Austrian Central Bank, we should invest more time and effort into finding opposing findings and research that comes to very different conclusions, and engage with that in an honest and upstanding manner, as Kevin called it. And if we have confident arguments why we reject it, move on. If we don't, we just have to invest more time before we take a policy decision. So having said all this, I hope that that conversation between the theory and philosophy of science and empirical economics and decision making keeps going on SUERF over the next couple of months. And thank you very much for that amazing seminar.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye
much.
bye.
Very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.